No bait! This is my 2019 Mac Pro that, as equipped, costs $9,799 from Apple's website. And guess what? I have listed it for sale. Why? Well, it's because I'm quitting Snazzy Labs. No, just kidding. I'm actually replacing it with this. I know that's not going to make a lot of sense until I explain myself, so let me explain myself. But first, speaking of quitting, Derek is quitting Snazzy Labs for an exciting new opportunity. Say goodbye, Derek.
Hey guys, what's up?
Okay, thanks, Derek. Just kidding. He actually has a few words at the end of this video for y'all. I'm obviously sad to be losing him, but I'm really excited for this new venture that he has. But what this means is that I'm hiring a new video producer effective immediately. If you're interested in this position, please find the application form linked below. You're probably thinking, oh no, not another iMac review. And look, I get it. There have been many of them. And I'm not gonna rehash what everyone has already said. But let me say this. I think this iMac has been reviewed as if it exists in a vacuum, graded on merits relative to itself, or to the abominably outdated computer it's replacing. Remember the one with a dual-core Intel Core i5-7360 CPU from 2016? A 1 terabyte spinning hard drive and a 1080p screen. They sold that until a few weeks ago.
They still sell it for like $1,000.
No, they don't. Holy crap. Okay, so they still sell it for $1,100. But this is clearly the replacement. And comparing it to that old trash fire is a fruitless exercise. So we need to think bigger. Let's skip the basic specs and feature walkthrough because you've no doubt seen those videos ad nauseum. And I'll get to my actual review of this machine in a minute, but first we need context, which requires us to take a look at Apple's entire lineup. There are now 4 models of Apple Silicon Mac. So the Mac Mini, the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro, and now this new iMac, that what would have been a surprise to most last year, they all run the same chip, like exactly the same, literally the same chip. This is unprecedented, but it's also likely to be short-lived. As soon as WWDC in a few weeks, we're expected to see these new Jade chips that have been rumored, and they'll probably be called like M1X or something. Now, Gizmodo says that there's going to be 5 new chips, but that's kind of a lie because there's really only going to be 1. To get a faster chip, you can do one of 2 things. You can either make the chip physically larger, giving you a greater area to fit transistors, or number 2, you can increase the density of the transistors by shrinking their process size. Now, if you care about efficiency, heat output, and total power draw, you're more than likely going to want to shrink the process size. But here's the problem: money. Making chip advancements is really expensive for 2 main reasons. Number 1, actually designing microchips costs a mind-boggling amount of money. You need to develop the architecture, you need to do verification and prototyping and fab testing, validation, and that's just for the hardware. And then you got to do the exact same thing for all the software. Look, the cost of developing a new 5 nanometer single chip SKU is estimated to be north of $1 billion. That's just to make the chip. And then you actually have to make the chip. Number 2, chip production has a pretty low yield rate relative to other industries. It's a very imperfect science, and the larger and denser the chip gets, well, the higher the likelihood that a defect can render the chip useless. So let me show you by looking at some math. This is a formula to determine chip yield rate if we consider a standard 300 millimeter wafer. Now, because wafers are circles and chips are not circles, a 300 millimeter diameter means that a 150 millimeter radius exists. And then we need our A variable, which is the surface area of our chip, also known as our die or die size. Now, if we take a medium-sized die of 360 millimeters, and then put this formula into Wolfram Alpha because doing math by hand is lame and hard, well, that gives us about 150 dies per wafer. Now, let's make the die 4 times smaller at just 99 millimeters. That'll give us 622 dies, which is a 3.7% increase. Okay, now let's talk defects. If we assume that there is a defect density of about 0.5 centimeters squared on each wafer, Well, you can see the issue. Our left wafer has about 24 defects, and our right wafer has about 30 defects. But again, math. Our yield rate is much lower when our chips are larger. So, problem solved. Just make smaller chips. But wait, I just said earlier that the more powerful chips need more transistors, and that means they need to be bigger. See the problem? We need big chips, but we can't make big chips. Well, the big brains at the smart people companies are moving to this idea of chiplet technology. The idea is that you save on development costs and increase your yield rates by just making one smaller chip. And then when you need a more powerful chip, you take two of those chips and glue them together, which makes one larger chip. Apple's upcoming Pro chip is rumored to be called, at least internally, Jade C die. It's expected to have 10 cores, 8 of which will be high performance, leaving 2 efficiency cores. And then it's also rumored to offer a 32-core GPU with up to 64 gigs of RAM. By itself, that's pretty impressive, and probably won't be found on the lower-end Pro products. So for that, there will be what is known as the Jade C chop, which is literally the standard Jade C chip, except for they will chop off half of the GPU cores, taking it down to 16. So I expect that chip to be found in low-end MacBook Pro models. But then for the big boy computers like the Mac Pro and upcoming perhaps iMac Pro, should Apple bring that thing back, and I think they should, that will come in a Jade 2C and a Jade 4C variant. So this will be 2 and 4 chiplets respectively combined. 4 of those chips stuck together. That highest end 4 chip thing would offer this ginormous 40-core CPU and 128-core GPU. That is amazing, but most certainly not coming for a hot sec, probably not even this year. So what was this video about again? Oh, right. The current M1 goes across almost the entire lineup. I mean, look, the fact that this iPad Pro and this iMac perform basically exactly the same, except for in very high intensity select workloads after 15 to 20 minutes of sustained performance, that is both incredibly impressive and underwhelming. That is, if you're looking to be underwhelmed. I keep seeing reviews of this machine saying, "Oh, rats, this isn't the Pro machine that I was hoping it to be." But that's like saying that you were disappointed the strip steak you bought wasn't a filet mignon. That was never the promise. This isn't a Pro product. But I would also challenge a lot of people that think they need a Pro Mac product to see if they actually do, because they probably don't. See, a lot of YouTube reviews benchmark computers in video editing applications because, well, most tech YouTubers are video editors. And that's all well and good, but the reality is that modern video editing is not really all that resource intensive, even with workloads that very much were a few years ago. Film Simplified found back in November that a base model Mac Mini with just 8 gigs of RAM running Resolve was more than capable of playing back red raw 4K files in their native resolution with 0 optimizations enabled, without a single frame drop, which is amazing. And the machine was even able to handle playback of an 8K red raw file with effect and color layers applied, so long as that the preview window was still at 4K instead of 8K, which is bananas. I mean, that is incredible. Now, is that to say that this M1 iMac is the fastest video editing machine that Apple has ever made? Well, no, though we did find that scrubbing our timeline was actually better on the iMac than the Mac Pro. But when it came to export times, yeah, the higher powered computer is gonna get the best of it. And Mac Pro was about 50% faster, but only about 50% faster, which is amazing considering that the Mac Pro literally costs 8 times more money and draws 10 times more power from the wall. Now, does this mean that the M1 can replace Mac Pro for most video editors? Well, maybe for most, but not for all. At least for us, a small studio that just makes a few videos per month, an extra 11 minutes on our video export times, it's not that big of a deal. Especially when you consider the fact that the iMac's vastly superior single-core performance makes it feel quicker and more responsive than the Mac Pro in literally every other scenario. I ran out of air. Now, there are still some scenarios in which the M1 isn't going to excel against its x86 brethren, particularly in graphics-heavy scenarios. However, I would suggest that you perform proper due diligence in finding out if the power you think yourself to actually need is actually needed. I am absolutely guilty of having over-purchased computer power in the past. Now, enough about the chip. Let's get to the iMac itself, because there are a lot of things to love about this machine. The display, in classic Apple fashion, it's fantastic. Now, while some might find 24 inches a bit on the small side, as I did, initially coming from a 34-inch ultra-wide, there's this really cool trick to make your display look bigger. Change the display scaling, and then move the screen closer to your face. The beautiful 4.5K resolution makes the screen look ultra sharp even at close distances, and after a few days, it feels completely natural. The P3 color space reproduction is awesome. However, I must note that like we saw with the Pro Display XDR last year, the corners tend to vignette a tiny bit. Not as bad as that monitor, but it's existent. Not a deal breaker, but it can be a bit distracting when you're editing and proofing photos and videos full screen. Now, the anti-reflective coating that they're using seems to be better than in recent years. Now, look, it's no XDR nano coating, but I don't think it's placebo. This thing is not a mirror either, like previous iMacs, which is nice. And there's a lot of smaller niceties that pros don't really care about, but normal people do, and they're actually really great upgrades. The webcam, for the first time in a long time on a Mac, actually looks pretty good. Finally. Now look, it sadly doesn't have that cool center stage feature from the iPad Pro, which seems like a strange omission given the family use nature of this desktop computer, but the image is sharp and the 3 microphone array, I mean, you can hear it sounds nice to callers on the other side, but it's not going to replace a dedicated mic for streaming or music production. It is, but for a quick Zoom and FaceTime call, it's pretty handy. Now, Apple bragged about its new speakers in this machine pretty extensively during the keynote, and I must say, they are very good and a very curious piece of engineering. Since the computer is so small, Apple has added these big metal radiators inside, which a lot of people suspected were for cooling, but they're not. They're for sound. The drivers dump into these chambers, and it helps low-end and mid-range bass significantly by providing surprisingly full dynamic range. You can even feel the back of the iMac kind of gently vibrate to the beat when you put your hand on it. Now, look, these are not going to replace dedicated audio setups. Even simple desktop speakers are probably still going to sound better. But for people that just use their all-in-one's built-in speakers or their monitor speakers, and spoiler alert, that's most people, this is going to be a hugely welcomed upgrade. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan of this computer, but that doesn't mean that I don't have my annoyances with it. First off, the new magnetic power connector is... On one hand, I like the idea of the power supply unit, which is one of the less reliable parts of the computer, being outside of the computer case. However, finding a place to put the fairly heavy 143-watt power adapter can be a bit of a chore. Furthermore, the connector isn't super MagSafe-esque in that it isn't easily removable. This is good because you're not going to accidentally bump or unplug power, but you also might not unplug power in an accident. You really have to give the cable a pretty quick, forceful directional pull to disconnect the cable without the machine sliding across the desk. Because yes, instead of grippy feet, the iMac has opted for slippery plastic feet, which is probably the right choice given that this computer is going to be found everywhere in hotel lobbies and retail stores where twisting the screen to face the customer will be commonplace. But it is kind of sketchy to think that if you trip over your iMac's power cable, you have a pretty good chance of just dragging it right off the desk. If you get the higher end model, and you really probably should for more reasons than one, we'll talk about that in a minute, the power supply comes with a NIC built-in, or network interface card, for, yes, Ethernet. Basically, the 4 twisted pairs that find themselves inside of an Ethernet cable, well, they just use up 8 of the pins that surround the connector's radius on the computer. It's brilliantly simple, and it works, having, well, 1 less cable plugged into the computer. It also has made cable management actually pretty nice. Totally unnecessary, but pretty nice. Now, what isn't nice is having just 2 Thunderbolt 3 connectors on a desktop computer. Now, like I mentioned, the higher end one is probably worth going for because that doubles the port count to 4. But you have to shell out the shekels, and the higher end model really only adds 2 standard 10 gigabit USB 3.1 Gen 2 ports. So you don't get any more Thunderbolt ports. And yeah, I recognize that this is a limitation of the M1, and it's also not a pro product, but it's also not a pro product. So this would have been nice to at least get a couple USB-A connectors that non-pros still use all the time, instead of relying on dongles for a massive desktop computer. But that's not possible because a USB-A connector is literally deeper than the entire computer. And that brings me to my last annoyance, the thinness, but not for the reasons you might expect. Look, I don't find the chin particularly sexy, but it is distinctly iMac, and I don't think it makes this a bad-looking computer. If you really miss that front Apple logo, well, that's nothing that stickers can't fix. And, well, since this houses an M1, thermals, despite the computer's thinness, they're not an issue either. It is kind of hilarious that not only did Apple relocate the CMOS battery away from the motherboard because it would have been too tall, but a standard CR2032, the cells they use on motherboards all the time, that would have still been too tall. So they're using 2 thinner cells that are wired in parallel on a separate PCB in the middle of the computer. Oh my goodness, that is hilarious engineering to fix a completely unnecessary problem, but that's Apple. The beef that I've got with the thinness is this. It has made hinge articulation even lesser than the previous iMac, which was already bad. Now, I can forgive the lack of display tilt, but zero height adjustability in 2021, it is completely unacceptable. And it encourages poor posture, neck craning, and RSI resulting behavior from anyone that is too short or too tall for whom this computer was designed, which is a very narrow window. Ergonomics should not be a pro feature. This needs a new stand. Now, this iMac is in a controversial spot too, because, well, it's not the machine that's going to get pro users to jump ship from Intel, but it's also just the same chipset that's used in the much cheaper $699 Mac Mini. And that computer also happens to come with better I/O and an internal power supply. Now, many people looking to maximize value, they're not going to find the iMac starting price point of nearly double the Mac Mini worth it for what amounts to mostly just an included monitor, keyboard, and mouse. But look, the iMac, it's never been about value. It has been about refinement and about cohesiveness for the masses. And this newest iteration, I mean, it just further solidifies the iMac as an AIO truly in a class of its own. There is a reason that the iMac is the best-selling desktop computer from Apple, and I have no hesitation, zero, recommending this computer and frankly, declaring it the best computer Apple to have ever made, because it is, and it's good enough for me to replace a computer that's far more expensive, capable, and powerful. And that's not just for me, but for most others. The iMac is probably all you need. Let me know, do you have any M1 Macs, or are you waiting for something better? If you are, did you even just watch this video? Just go buy one, they're awesome. Or wait a week, WWDC is very soon. All right, well, I'm done talking. Stay snazzy.
How's it going, Snazzy fam? As you've probably been aware, I've been the one that's been behind the scenes shooting and editing for Quinn for the last 2 years. Unfortunately, I am leaving to start a new venture. But this is super good news for you, because it means that you could have the opportunity to work at Snazzy Labs. And while getting to tell people that you work on YouTube is, well, it's fun, it's way better working with someone who's as gifted as Quinn. Now, don't get me wrong, working in YouTube has its challenges, but it is quite literally how I landed this new job opportunity. While I considered myself to be a good filmmaker, whatever that means, before, there is nothing that compares to the skill set that I was able to acquire while learning with one of the best. I'm a little biased. Listen, those of you that want to become great filmmakers know that filmmaking is already hard enough, and that it can take literally hundreds of hours of shooting and editing to get there. All of my colleagues can attest that of my 6 years as a filmmaking professional, that I've probably gotten the best in the last 2, working with Quinn. So, if you've ever wanted to take the leap and learn the ins and outs of YouTube and become a better filmmaker in the process, consider hitting the link down below for a chance at working with Quinn, now a dear friend of mine, and one of the best tech pundits in the space. And maybe you'll be the video producer that actually brings Snazzy's millionth subscriber. And as a completely shameless plug, consider following me to my new channel, Life with Scott, where we bask in the world of startups and perform social experiments along the way. It'll be fun. Follow it.